Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Toronto, Canada on June 29th, 2025. This week, the world received definitive confirmation that NATO governments have gone completely bonkers. On Tuesday, June 25th, at a summit held at The Hague in the Netherlands, NATO governments agreed to increase their military spending to a stratospheric 5% of GDP by 2035, so in about a decade or so. The Hague is a city of about 500,000 people on the North Sea coast of the Netherlands. It's home to the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the United Nations, and the International Criminal Court, which, given its failure to prosecute any Western war criminals, tends to go by the name nowadays of the International Caucasian Court. Now, there's a cruel irony in NATO's decision to stage this disgraceful summit at The Hague. After all, NATO governments are led by some of the world's most dangerous war criminals and terrorists, including but not limited to Donald J. Trump, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, and Keir Starmer. Among other crimes against humanity, they are all guilty of aiding and abetting genocide in occupied Palestine, if not perpetrating it outright themselves. It was in that spirit that I seized the opportunity of their appearance at The Hague to put an urgent message out to the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. As I mentioned in my post on June 25th, the world's most dangerous terrorists and war criminals were meeting right now in The Hague, steps away from the International Criminal Court, and I urge the prosecutors to take the opportunity to arrest the cabal of psychopaths in one fell swoop. Sadly, however, and predictably, my call went unheeded by the ICC prosecutors. So what exactly happened on June 25th? Well, I'm going to show you the rather brief declaration that was put out by NATO governments on that day. This is the Hague Summit Declaration that you're seeing. Unfortunately, it's a little bit small for you to read. I'm going to see if I can enlarge it for you. Apparently not. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the highlighted sections for you so that you can get a sense of what exactly was decided here and not decided. In the first paragraph, predictably, the heads of the North Atlantic Alliance referred to NATO as the, quote, strongest alliance in history, close quote. That would be the same alliance that after 20 years of brutal warfare and trillions of wasted dollars fled Afghanistan in 2021 with their tails between their legs, having been driven from the country by a ragtag insurgency force that possessed little more than Soviet-era small arms. This, the strongest alliance in history, would also be the same alliance that is having its ass handed to it in Ukraine by the Russian Federation, even though the Russian Federation, as I'm going to discuss a little later in this report, spends about 15% of the amount of money on its military that is spent by the United States alone. And this would also be the same NATO military alliance, which pretty much got humiliated days ago in Iran's retaliatory strikes against the genocidal entity in Israel. You see, NATO brought to bear to defend the genocidal entity from those retaliatory strikes the very best air defense systems that it could muster, and every day, again and again, Iran's ballistic missiles and sometimes even their drones penetrated those air defenses with devastating effect. So much for the strongest alliance in history. Now, in the second paragraph of this declaration, the NATO governments stated as follows. First of all, they identified Russia as the long-term threat posed to Euro-Atlantic security. They also identified one other threat which necessitated an increase in military spending, according to them, and that was the, quote, persistent threat of terrorism, close quote, which is quite ironic because, as I mentioned at the outset, there is no one on God's green earth who engages in worse forms of terrorism with greater frequency and vehemence than NATO governments themselves and their proxies in West Asia. Now, they went on to state, the NATO governments in this declaration, that they committed to invest 5% of GDP annually. They love to use that word invest, even though I think a much more accurate term would be waste, squander, or my personal favorite, flush down the toilet. They vowed to commit or invest 5% of GDP annually on core defense requirements as well as defense and security-related spending by 2035. Then in the third paragraph, they stated as follows. Allies will allocate at least 3.5% of GDP annually based on the agreed definition of NATO defense expenditure by 2035 to resource core defense requirements and to meet the NATO capability targets. And allies will account for up to 1.5% of GDP annually to, among other things, protect our critical infrastructure, defend our networks, ensure our civil preparedness and resilience, unleash innovation, and strengthen our defense industrial base. And finally, in paragraph 3 of this declaration, they stated allies reaffirm their enduring sovereign commitments to provide support to Ukraine, whose security contributes to ours. Quite interesting that they view this as a security-enhancing measure, the hundreds of billions of dollars they flushed down the NATO proxy war toilet in Ukraine, because I would have thought that waging war through a proxy against the largest country in the world that has enough nukes to destroy humanity several times over was not particularly conducive to our security. But what do I know? Now, my read of this rather pithy declaration, and when you consider the stakes raising military spending to this extraordinary level, it's remarkable that so little was said in this declaration. So as best as I can, the way I read this is that at some level, the so-called leaders of NATO states recognize that spending 5% of GDP on military expenditures is likely to be unachievable and in fact is really pie in the sky. So what they've done is they've given themselves some wiggle room. They've stipulated that 3.5% has to go to what NATO has consistently defined as core defense requirements and really military related spending. And then another 1.5% for a total of 5% would go to what they describe as protection of critical infrastructure, defending our networks, ensuring civil preparedness and resilience, and unleashing innovation. These terms are so broad and ambiguous, they're not defined in the summit declaration, that they could conceivably make an argument that expenditures that are really for purely civilian purposes fall within this category of expenditure for purposes of meeting the 5% of GDP target by 2035. So I think that what is going on here is a bit of subterfuge. And in addition, the fact that they're crystallizing the commitment 10 years from now, which in the life of many politicians in the West, particularly nowadays, is an eternity, also affords them certain wiggle room. It's far from clear that any of the signatories to this declaration will be in power when the time actually comes to meet the 5% of military spending target. But I don't want to be taken to be suggesting that this is not something that should be taken with the utmost seriousness by citizens of Western countries, because even if this statement does give them significant wiggle room to avoid spending 5% of GDP on military expenditures, on merchants of death, let's be honest about that, that's what's going on here. Nonetheless, it will clearly create an enormous amount of pressure on NATO governments to increase their already extraordinarily high military spending, and that will have, as I'm going to discuss shortly, extremely negative impacts on ordinary citizens, and in particular, the most vulnerable members of society. So, having read the summit declaration, I took some time yesterday to crunch some numbers and tried to ascertain what 5% of GDP on military expenditures would look like. And so this is a chart that I compiled after retrieving nominal GDP figures for each member state of NATO for the most recent calendar year, 2024. Then I multiplied that figure by 0.05 to arrive at 5% of GDP according to 2024 nominal GDP figures. And then in the right-hand column, the furthest to the right, I identified the current levels of military spending for 5 NATO states, namely Canada, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Germany. Now, what can we ascertain by looking at these figures? Well, first of all, you can see that the level of expenditure they're calling for is truly mind-boggling. So in the case of Canada, Canada currently spends, if you look in the upper right-hand corner of this sheet, $25.3 billion. By the way, all of these numbers are stated in US dollars. So they've been converted from local currencies to US currency. So in US dollars, Canada currently spends $25.3 billion. If Canada were spending 5% of its 2024 nominal GDP, it would be spending $107 billion US this year on the military, which is more than 4 times the current level of expenditure. In the case of France, if France were to be spending 5% of 2024 GDP, rather than expending what it's actually expending now, or reports it's expending, 59.1 billion US, it would be spending 152.5 billion US. So that's well over twice what it is currently spending. In the case of the United Kingdom, current military expenditure is reported to be US 78 billion. Were it to be spending 5% of 2024 nominal GDP, the United Kingdom would be spending $170 billion US, which is a little more than twice the amount that it is currently spending. Then we go to the United States, which is currently spending almost $1 trillion US dollars a year on the military. Were it to be spending 5% of 2024 nominal GDP, that would rise to $1.39 trillion, another $390 billion on top of what is already by far the world's largest military budget. And then finally, the spending figure for Germany, the current military spending of Germany is reported to be 88.5 billion US. Were Germany to be spending this year 5% of its 2024 nominal GDP, that figure would rise to the extraordinary sum of $226.5 billion. So well over twice what it's currently spending. Now, I don't know about you, but it doesn't seem to me to be a particularly good idea to be urging Germany to become by far Europe's largest military spender. The last time Germany adopted a hyper-militaristic attitude, that didn't work out too well for humanity. Now, let's flip over to the second page of this chart that I've generated. And you will see that I've added up all of the putative military expenditures, assuming that NATO governments were currently spending 5% of 2024 nominal GDP. And what it comes to is the truly astonishing amount of US dollars 2.6 trillion. Were NATO governments to be spending 5% of their 2024 GDP this year, that is the amount of money they would be spending on their militaries. If that doesn't trouble you, I don't know what will, my friends. Now, to give you some sense of perspective, I've also looked at the current military expenditures of Russia. And you'll see under the heading official enemies, because Russia is, of course, designated by NATO as an official enemy, the current military expenditures of Russia are reported to be the equivalent of 149 billion US. That is 6.2% of Russia's reported nominal GDP in 2024. So what that means, and I think anybody could readily grasp the point I wish to make here, is that Russia is currently spending approximately 15% of what the United States alone spends. And Russia is waging a war effectively against the entirety of NATO on its border within approximately 1,000 kilometers from Moscow against the entirety of NATO through a Ukrainian proxy. And even in those circumstances, Russia's military spending is a mere 15% of the current military spending of the United States. And of course, if you were to add in all the military spending currently being undertaken by other NATO countries, probably the percentage of that figure that Russia is spending on its military would fall well below 10%. So a painfully obvious question that arises in this context is, why aren't current military expenditures sufficient to counter the supposed threat that Russia poses to the collective West? What truly amazes me is that, as obvious as that question is, I have never once heard or seen it asked by a corporate media hack in the West to any leader of a Western country. There is absolutely no plausible justification for increasing military spending when the official enemy of NATO is spending so little in relation to the collectivity of NATO. Now, NATO, of course, from time to time, has identified other threats. It didn't identify any state other than Russia in its June 25th Hague Summit declaration, but there's been a lot of belligerence, obviously, directed by NATO governments towards three other states, namely China, North Korea, and Iran. So I took the liberty of determining what their military spending is in the current year. You'll see their military spending identified again at the bottom of this second page of my chart under the heading Official Enemies. China's current military spending is reported to be 314 billion US, or 1.7% of its 2024 nominal GDP. North Korea, a truly minuscule number by the standards of Western states, is reported to be spending 1.47 billion, which happens to account for approximately 5% of its nominal 2024 GDP. At least it's estimated. I'm not sure that anybody in the West really knows what North Korea's nominal GDP is, but let's assume that's correct. It's 5%, yes, but it's only $1.47 billion US. And then Iran is reported to be spending 7.9 billion US dollars on its military, despite all the hostility being directed against it by the genocidal entity, which spends far more money on its military than 7.9 billion. And this amounts to a mere 2% of Iran's 2024 nominal GDP. So when you add all of that up, you arrive, you'll see at the bottom of the page, beside the word total, at the grand sum of US $472.4 billion. This is significantly less than 50% of the military spending of the United States alone, the current military spending. And I should point out that not too long ago, I interviewed Vijay Prashad of the Tricontinental Institute, who, with another colleague, had done an analysis of U.S. military spending and came to the conclusion, and this was, I believe, last year or the prior year, that actual U.S. military spending in the United States was in the range of 1.6 trillion. But let's assume that it's only the official number put out by the United States government. Even then, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran collectively spend less than 50% of United States military spending. Why, in heaven's name, would it be necessary for the entirety of NATO to jack up their military spending to 5% of GDP, or even 3.5% of GDP, or hell, even 2% of GDP, when the states they've identified as the primary threats to the West spend so much less than they do? What could possibly justify so massive an expenditure? Is it inefficiency? Is it corruption? Is it technological incapacity? The lack of an industrial base? I don't know, folks. But for the life of me, I can't imagine what rationale they could possibly proffer, a persuasive rationale for increasing military spending in these circumstances. And if the corporate media hacks who actually have access to these warmongers were doing their jobs and putting this question, I suspect that they would fall into a state of rambling incoherence, because there would be nothing that they could offer as a remotely plausible justification for this level of military spending. Now, I want to make a few other remarks about these figures that I've just shared with you. First of all, as I indicated, the figures we just looked at were based on nominal GDP. And the reason why I used nominal GDP is because that apparently is the measure of GDP that NATO uses to establish its military spending target for its member states. But there's another way to measure GDP, and it's called purchasing power parity. GDP comparisons using purchasing power parity are arguably more useful than those using nominal GDP when assessing the domestic market of a state, because PPP, purchasing power parity, takes into account the relative cost of local goods, services, and inflation rates of the country, rather than using international market exchange rates, which may distort the real differences in per capita income. The GDP of Russia and China, it's important to note, is far larger in purchasing power parity terms than in nominal terms. The International Monetary Fund forecasts the nominal GDP of Russia to be 2.1 trillion for 2025, but in purchasing power parity terms, the IMF estimates or forecasts that Russia's GDP in 2025 will amount to $7.2 trillion, more than 3 times the nominal GDP forecast of the IMF for Russia. Now, Russia's current military spending of 149 billion is only 2.1% of its forecasted purchasing power parity GDP for 2025, but it's 7.1% of Russia's forecasted nominal GDP for 2025, because, as I said, nominal GDP for Russia is forecasted to be much lower than its PPP GDP. Similarly, the IMF forecasts the nominal GDP of China to be 19.2 trillion for 2025, but in purchasing power parity terms, the IMF forecasts China's GDP in 2025 to be more than double that amount, 40.1 trillion, which would make it by far the largest economy in the world. Now, China's current military spending of 314 billion is only 0.8% of its estimated purchasing power parity GDP for 2025, but is 1.6% of its estimated nominal GDP for 2025. So whether Russia's military spending seems large relative to the average NATO country depends on whether one measures Russia's military spending by nominal GDP or PPP GDP. If one measures it by PPP GDP, then Russia's military spending is in line with that of the average NATO country, notwithstanding the fact that it is effectively waging war against the entirety of NATO through a Ukrainian proxy. As a percentage of GDP, China's military spending is low compared to the average NATO country. This is true whether one measures China's GDP in nominal or PPP terms. But if one uses PPP GDP, China's military spending is very low relative to the average NATO country, less than 1% of GDP. Now, here's another obvious question about NATO's spending target that the corporate media never ask. Why is the military spending target the same for each member of NATO? Now, I ask this question for 2 reasons. First, the threats confronting NATO members are not the same. On the assumption that the primary threat to NATO is the Russian Federation, some NATO members are clearly more threatened than others. In particular, those countries that border on Russia and that historically have had troubled relations with Russia are clearly at greater risk of military conflict with the Russian Federation than NATO countries in Western Europe, and in particular in North America. Obviously, it would be far easier for Russia to attack and to sustain military operations in NATO countries bordering on its western flank, particularly the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, as well as Poland and Romania. Given that they need NATO protection, those states, far more than, for example, Canada or the United States need NATO protection, why shouldn't Eastern European states have a higher military spending target than NATO members that are far away from Russia and that have no history of military conflict with Russia, such as Canada? Maybe there's an answer to that question, but certainly it's a question that ought to be posed. and we ought to hear the justification for applying the same military spending target to all states, regardless of the particular threats that they confront. And in this context, I want to point out that as a Canadian, and I've said this for many years, NATO is a terrible deal for Canada. And I'm going to explain why. First of all one has to do is look at a map to understand that Canada is protected by formidable natural barriers. Canada has a border with only one country, the United States, and although there are many indications for those of us who are looking rationally at the situation that the United States government is indeed a threat to Canada, that's not the official line of the Canadian government, and it hasn't been for a long time. Not at any point in my lifetime has the Canadian government described the U.S. as anything other than its closest ally, and it continues to behave as though the United States is its closest ally. So the threats, to the extent they exist in the case of Canada, would be coming from countries that are separated from Canada by vast oceans. That's the first thing. Now, just think logistically. You don't have to be a military expert to understand that if some country like Russia or China was tempted to launch some kind of military operation against Canada, try to occupy some part of Canadian territory, they would confront enormous obstacles. Not only would they have to attempt some amphibious landing thousands of kilometers from their own shores, but then they would have to support and supply their forces on Canadian territory across long distances over open waters. And they would be highly vulnerable to attack, both the forces that are stationed on Canadian territory and those that are trying to support and supply them. But quite apart from all of that, just sort of the practical difficulties involved in launching any kind of military operation against Canada, let's be clear here, folks. If a hostile military force, particularly of a major military power like the Russian Federation or China, were to launch an attack on Canada, the United States would unquestionably get involved whether Canada wanted it to or not. The United States government is never going to tolerate hostile military forces on its northern or southern border. It's simply out of the question. We got a taste of the U.S. intolerance for hostile military forces in its sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost resulted in a nuclear conflagration. So I think that every major military power on this earth understands perfectly well that were they to attempt some kind of military operation against the sovereign territory of Canada, the United States would bring to bear the full force of its military fury to defeat and expel any invader. And as I say, it would do that whether or not the Canadian government sought its help or authorized it to become involved. That's quite clear. Governments around the world understand that. And so even if they coveted Canada's resources or territory and were tempted to try to seize them by military force, the deterrent of U.S. intervention would almost certainly dissuade them, in addition to the formidable logistical challenges that they would confront if they tried to mount such a military operation. I mean, frankly, the only way in the real world in which Canada is potentially threatened militarily is by intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's the only significant military threat that Canada confronts. So if you want to deal with that, what would you do? You would buy the best air defense systems that money can obtain for you. You don't need F-35 fighter jets, by the way, to counter a ballistic missile threat. You can use air defense batteries, ground-based, air defense batteries, firing surface-to-air missiles to defend yourself. The problem, of course, for Canada is that it purchases its military equipment exclusively from Western states. And we have learned in both the Ukraine war and the most recent round of criminal aggression by the genocidal entity against Iran that Western air defenses, including the most sophisticated air defenses that Western militaries have devised, are grossly inadequate to defend against ballistic missiles, and particularly hypersonic missiles. So if Canada wants to defend itself against any potential attack by ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, frankly, it would have to look outside of NATO to find air defense systems that could do the job. And certainly F-35s ain't going to do it. So that's the first couple of things I want to raise in regard to this military spending target, questions that ought to be asked that are never asked. There's also another reason why I think we should oblige Western governments to explain why the military spending target is the same for every single NATO state. And the reason for this is that the capacity of various NATO states to expend 5% of GDP on their militaries varies widely from one state to another. And to give you a simple example, let's take the case of Germany. Germany has a debt to GDP ratio of 62.5%. Greece, on the other hand, also a NATO member, has a debt to GDP ratio of 154%. Greece, in fact, almost went bankrupt a few years ago. And by the way, one of the governments that is most responsible for the near destruction of Greece's economy is that of Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor. And of course, the ECB and the IMF also played a dastardly role in inflicting upon Greece an economy-wrecking austerity package, or a series of them, I should say. So quite clearly, at a debt to GDP ratio of 154%, which almost brought Greece to a state of bankruptcy just years ago, Greece is far less capable of committing 5% of its GDP year after year to military expenditure than is Germany and a host of other NATO members. But the governments of NATO, for some incomprehensible reason, have decided to take a one-size-fits-all approach, completely heedless of the grotesque disparities in the capacities of various NATO governments to incur and sustain these expenditures. Now, there's one other thing I want to say about this obligation of reciprocal defense in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. I submit to you that this creates perverse incentives because the countries that border upon Russia, the Lilliputians, one might call them, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and in addition, the more significant military powers in Eastern Europe, Poland and Romania, they tend to adopt a rather belligerent attitude towards the Russian Federation, not just actually to the state of Russia, but also, in particular in the case of the Baltic states, towards Russian speakers and ethnic Russians living in those countries. One could fairly describe their attitude towards the Russian people as being outright Russophobic. And one wonders if they did not have the guarantee, the assurance, the security blanket of Article 5 protection under the NATO treaty, would they behave this way in such a belligerent and provocative manner towards the Russian Federation? I very much doubt it, folks. I suspect that they would feel obliged to try to maintain good neighborly relations with the Russian Federation if they had to fend for themselves. And frankly, I think that their maintaining good neighborly relations with the Russian Federation would be a good thing, not only for the people of those countries and Russians, but for the whole world. The last thing we need are more wars. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of what the practical implications will be of raising NATO military spending to 5% of GDP. And for this purpose, I'm going to focus on the most recent federal budget of Canada, the government of Canada, but the types of questions I will raise in this context are likely to be applicable to most, if not all, NATO governments. So Canada's federal budget for 2024-25 projected a total of Canadian $449.2 billion in budgetary spending. And the highest federal expenditures by government department in the most recent budget included the following. First, the Department of Employment and Social Development was allocated $11.5 billion. The Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs was allocated $10.9 billion. The Department of Health, $8.4 billion. The Department of Industry, $5.9 billion. And the Office of Infrastructure, $5.8 billion. Now, if Canada had spent 5% of its 2024 GDP on the military in the current fiscal year, then military spending would have amounted in the current fiscal year to Canadian $147 billion. That is 14 times the amount of money allocated to the Department of Employment and Social Development, which was the largest allocation of any department in the Canadian government in the most recent fiscal year. If the federal budget in the current year had remained at the level of $549 billion, notwithstanding an increase in military spending to 5% of GDP, then military spending would have constituted 33%, 1/3 of Canada's federal budget. By contrast, military spending in Canada's most recent fiscal year is actually, assuming the figures we've been given are accurate, 8% of the federal budget. Now, how will Canada go from spending 8% of its budget on the military to 33% of its budget without cutting spending on things like healthcare, infrastructure, or social programs? Some might claim that NATO countries will be able to maintain current spending levels on non-military programs such as healthcare, education, or infrastructure by increasing dramatically overall government spending. But where would all of that additional money come from? Are NATO governments going to implement massive tax increases on those who are most capable to bear them? In other words, the affluent members of NATO society? In fact, many of the governments that comprise the NATO military alliance are going in the opposite direction by lowering taxes on the rich. The most notorious example, of course, being the Trump administration with its legislative behemoth, which it has called the Big Beautiful Act. Like the first Trump administration, this one, through that legislation, seeks to dramatically lower taxes on the most affluent members of American society. Here in Canada, we've also gotten a taste of the tax-cutting proclivities of the current Canadian Prime Minister, whom I affectionately refer to as Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, because he was, after all, an elite Goldman Sachs banker for 12 years before moving on to the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, and then being handed the political throne here in our country. And what did Mark Carney do promptly upon replacing Justin Trudeau as the Canadian Prime Minister a few months ago? Well, he immediately axed a modest proposal for increasing somewhat the taxation of capital gains. This is the preferential treatment, tax treatment accorded to capital gains, has long been a means by which the wealthy accumulate more and more wealth, and the problem of inequality becomes exacerbated because passive income is something that is available principally to people who have significant savings. But people who simply have enough money to meet their day-to-day expenditures do not have significant savings to invest. They cannot benefit nearly to the same degree, if at all, from the preferential tax treatment that is accorded to capital gains in this country. So as I say, there was a proposal for a modest increase in the taxation of capital gains in Canada. The proposal, which was from the prior Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, was not that, capital gains would be taxed in the same way as employment income, which it should. In fact, if anything, capital gains should attract a higher tax rate than employment income. But he wasn't proposing that. He wasn't even coming close to proposing that. He was just going to increase somewhat the taxation of capital gains. Mark Carney shot that proposal dead as soon as he ascended to the position of Prime Minister. So there's little reason to believe that Prime Minister Goldman Sachs is going to be inclined to fund massive increases in military spending by increasing taxes on the wealthy. What is much more likely to happen is that in the near term, we are going to incur substantially larger deficits, not just we in Canada, but throughout NATO. The governments of NATO, the alliance, will take on far more debt. Many of them, not only Greece, other members of NATO are already in a territory that is arguably unsustainable from a debt service perspective. And then when things become dire in a fiscal sense, we are going to be told by the neoliberals who rule us that it's time for us to tighten our belts. They love to use that phrase. It's kind of a folksy way of saying that we're going to crush you through austerity. But ultimately, that's what it's going to amount to. We are going to have austerity shoved down our throats on steroids once it becomes absolutely crystal clear that our governments do not have the fiscal capacity to sustain even 3.5% of GDP on military expenditure, let alone 5% of GDP. Now, of course, these types of hard questions have begun to percolate around Prime Minister Goldman Sachs. And for that purpose, I want to share with you an article that appeared in the Ottawa Citizen in the last few days. And you'll see here that Carney was asked up in the first paragraph of this excerpt from the Ottawa Citizen article about how they were going to fund these increases in military spending. And he said, if we are moving to the higher and higher levels of defense spending, because that's necessary, and by the way, as I've indicated, that is not remotely necessary, then he said, we will have to make considerations about what less the federal government can do in certain cases and how we're going to pay for it, close quote. Needless to say, he didn't offer any meaningful details about what those considerations might be or what means of funding the massive increases in military spending could possibly be. He simply recognized in an ambiguous, non-specific way that some cutting may be necessary from the federal budget. So the Ottawa Citizen article then goes on to quote Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux, who said he doesn't have enough information to determine how the Carney government will meet its spending commitments. Shortly before the NATO meeting, Giroux told Bloomberg News that for Canada to finance the 5% GDP defense hike, it would require a major shift of government priorities away from social spending, for example, to free up some of the resources currently allocated to these types of expenses towards defense. The spending hike could also be financed by, quote, some tax increases for sure, or much higher deficits, close quote, Giroux added. And then the Ottawa Citizen concludes by saying retired senior military officers such as General Wayne Eyre, the former Chief of Defense Staff, and Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve have previously suggested that cuts to social programs might be needed to fund more defense spending. Yeah, these people ain't your friends, my fellow Canadians. The military brass never saw a military spending increase that they didn't like. The more money they get, the more expensive killing machines they're able to buy, and the more power they're able to accumulate. So no one should regard them as neutral arbiters in the question of whether NATO governments should be increasing their military spending beyond the already obscene levels that we, the citizens of the West, are required to bear. Now, what's particularly disgraceful about all of this, in my opinion, is that this commitment by Canada's Prime Minister to raise military spending by 2035 to 5% of GDP happened only days after we learned of another military industrial boondoggle in which Canada has become embroiled. You see, Canada, a couple of years ago, under the Trudeau government, and despite his suggestions that he would not approve the purchase of F-35s from the United States, did ultimately agree to purchase, I believe, somewhere in the range of 70 or 80, I can't remember the precise number, of these lemons, these extraordinarily overpriced and overrated warplanes that have just mind-boggling maintenance needs. He agreed to purchase them, and the Auditor General of Canada in early June published a report examining cost overruns in this project, which the Canadian government has dubbed the Future Fighter Capability Project. And what the Auditor General found was that to buy 88 F-35A fighter aircraft from the United States, the government had originally estimated the cost to be 19 billion. This is Canadian dollars. By 2024, and I'm quoting here the Auditor General, issues like foreign exchange fluctuations and rising facilities costs increased the estimate to 27.7 billion, almost 50% more than originally anticipated. That projection does not include other elements needed for full operational capability, such as essential infrastructure upgrades and advanced weapons. These would add at least 5.5 billion to the total cost. We also found that the Future Fighter Capability Project was facing delays in building key infrastructure to support the aircraft, which National Defense refers to as CF-35As. Construction of 2 new fighter squadron facilities to support operations was expected to be completed only in 2031, more than 3 years behind schedule, and costs to develop an interim operation solution to support the new jets will further increase infrastructure expenses. So it was in that context, in the revelation of another military-industrial boondoggle, that Prime Minister Goldman Sachs decided to take Canada's military spending to unprecedented peacetime levels. As I mentioned, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux, indicated just hours before Carney committed to this 5% of GDP military spending target that he didn't have enough information to ascertain how these increases in military spending were going to be funded. And I would suggest to you, my friends, that if we actually lived in a democracy, this is how this entire issue, which is of the utmost importance to the future of Western society, this is how it would have been addressed. First of all, our governments, before agreeing to spend 5% of GDP on their militaries, would have commissioned independent experts to conduct a thorough examination of the long-term budgetary implications of these military spending increases. Then they would have published the findings and analysis of those experts. And finally, after the public had been given an opportunity to digest the analysis and the findings of the experts, the governments of NATO would have encouraged, promoted a robust public debate about the wisdom of implementing these massive increases in military spending. Canada has done none of those things, and to my knowledge, no NATO government has done any of those things. And we are told that we live in the democratic part of the world, in the part of the world that is characterized by transparency, by respect for the rights and interests of ordinary citizens. I don't think so. And I would also point out that, when Donald Trump first began flapping his gums about, other NATO states spending 5% of GDP on their militaries, I personally believe, because the number was so wildly unrealistic from my perspective and would be so catastrophic for the finances of Western governments, I assumed that Donald Trump was simply throwing that out there as a negotiating tactic. He didn't really expect that NATO governments would sign off on 5% of GDP in military spending, but he was trying to pressure them to increase it well above 2%, and he was trying to get as much money into the greedy paws of the U.S. military-industrial complex as he could, understanding all the while that 5% was probably an unrealistic number. But as it turns out, all of Washington's vassals rushed to lick the boots of the Donald, and without making any apparent effort to negotiate him down from the 5% of GDP precipice, they readily acceded to that number, and did so before there was any meaningful analysis of the budgetary implications of this, or the impact upon the most vulnerable members of our society of reallocating all of this money to merchants of death. We were told in the most recent Canadian federal election that Mark Carney was the best person to stand up to Donald Trump. As far as I can tell, Mark Carney is the best person to turn Canada into Donald Trump's personal doormat. It won't surprise you to know that in this context, the merchants of death are corking open the champagne. Here's a report published on June 26th, the day after the issuance of the Hague Summit Declaration, entitled NATO Summit Sends Defense Stocks Up as States Expected to Diverge on 5% Military Spending Target. The target path The subtitle is that the target path is gradual and uneven. And then at the outset of the article in bold, it states defense contractors have seen their share prices climb vertiginously following the annual NATO summit taking place in the Netherlands on Wednesday. Now, that's a word you don't hear very often in the mainstream media, vertiginously. And the reason why you're hearing it now is because the degree to which military contractors stand to profit from this boondoggle is truly mind-boggling. You know, back in, I believe it was January of 1961, one of the most respected political figures or military figures in the history of the United States, and indeed the Western world, Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave a speech of which many of you will be aware, in which he warned of the imminent dangers to democracy of the military-industrial complex. And I believe, in fact, that it was President Eisenhower who coined that term. Well, there's no indication that his warning, as dire as it was heeded by anybody in a position of power. In the 1960s, one voice of peace after another was snuffed out. JFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and of course Bobby Kennedy, amongst others. And now this cancer of militarism has spread not only throughout the body politic of the United States, but through the entirety of Western society. And today we are beholden, utterly beholden, as this disgraceful summit demonstrated beyond a shadow of doubt, to the military-industrial complex. The time to oppose this, my friends, is now. Don't wait until the massive new expenditures begin. Don't wait until they begin to implement huge cuts to social spending and have impose upon you dramatically negative repercussions for you and your families. The time to put pressure on these warmongers to abandon this insane decision is now. And I will stand shoulder to shoulder with any of you who wants to take on that task. For now, this is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from Toronto, Ontario on June 29th, 2025.